The Brain Hardwired in History. Please join me in welcoming Larry McGrath.
Thank you, Ethan, for such a warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here at Wesleyan now in my third week on the job, and I'm especially humbled that so many of you came out to attend this evening. And I'm especially thankful to have really excellent colleagues down at the Center for the Humanities who've been encouraging me, especially as I kick off this lecture series, and I'm looking forward to reciprocate for all of you. So let me just jump in there. The human brain weighs about 3 pounds and amounts to roughly 2% of our body weight. If we were to arrange the organ's 86 billion neurons in a cable, it would extend several 100,000 miles long. That cable would be wet and soft, a substance much closer to soup. Yet, we are accustomed to talking about the brain's cabling as hard. Innate features of our mental life are hardwired. Indeed, the figure of the hardwired brain circulates throughout popular culture and news media. Hardwiring offers an all too succinct metaphor to resolve a perennial problem: how to connect the immaterial dimensions of the self, including emotion, language, and cognition, with the material substance of the brain. The metaphor plays on two senses in which our brain wiring is supposedly hard. It signifies both an intrinsic character well anchored in our physiology, and at the same time, the idea that the conduits of brain activity are electrical. It's captured in a classic scene from The Matrix, in which the protagonist Neo learns Kung Fu by having his skull connected to a computer that loads a karate module directly to his brain. In a virtual simulator, Neo proceeds to demonstrate his new skills by sparring with Morpheus. So the figure of hardwiring, as we see, functions to suture, self, and soma. The phrase itself has a relatively short history, having emerged with the computing boom in the early 1970s. Hardwiring was first used to describe the connections of a circuit board. But soon, the figure appeared in a 1971 issue of New Scientist, in which it applied to neurology. The article documents the neural constraints on the visual capacities of lizards, frogs, and cats. Now, interestingly, the term wiring, which appears between quotation marks to make its metaphorical status clear, describes the reconstruction of the animal's visual field despite damage to their optical regions, evidence of the brain wire's plasticity. This is at least the payoff in the debut article for hardwiring in English. But as the metaphor trickled into and eventually inundated popular culture, the now colloquial phrase shed the quotation marks. Even though hardwiring is a recent linguistic conception, the idea that the brain is wired has a deeper history. It extends back to the advent of neurology and experimental psychology in the 19th century. These domains fused the nascent science of biology to the study of consciousness. And by the beginning of the 20th century, departments of psychology became a feature of British, French, German, and even American universities. But the genesis of neurology and experimental psychology exceeded disciplinary boundaries, spilling beyond the confines of laboratory inquiry. It was communications technologies, above all the telegraph and the telephone, that shaped conceptions of the nervous system during their embryonic development in the 19th century. It is worthwhile to revisit this period of scientific exploration, I'd like to suggest, as a reminder that the brain sciences came to life within an intellectual and cultural milieu that was not exclusively scientific. Despite our penchant for talking about the brain as a wired organ, the figure is an anachronism, really the relic of a mechanical approach to the neurosciences, which has largely been abandoned over the past 20 years and replaced with a biochemical approach to studying the brain. The endurance of hardwiring, despite these transformations within the neuroscientific research, however, casts the cultural dimension of our contemporary neurological moment into stark relief. The prefix neuro now appears across incipient fields such as neuroethics, neuroaesthetics, neuroeconomics, and even in my own field, neurohistory, not to mention the aisles of your grocery supermarket. Furthermore, a cottage industry of cerebral self-help literature promises that if you fix your brain, you can fix yourself. Evidence of a growing trend to identify selfhood with the brain. And anybody who listens to almost any show on NPR is usually bombarded with advertisements for these sites of brain training programs, notably Lumosity.com. It's interesting to think that about 30 or perhaps even 20 years ago, these would have instead been pitched as memory training websites. The neurosciences confer a certain prestige on our research. The talk I'm presenting this evening, at least, is evidence enough, I'd like to think. But more seriously, hardwiring a given concept, whether it's anxiety, tragedy, romance, or even history, lends a materialist cachet to questions otherwise subject to interpretive inquiry. That is, questions whose stakes turn on their meaning and which are to be engaged in the humanities through argument. So by revisiting the history of the brain sciences and their cultural resonances, my aim is not to sound a battle cry in an academic turf war, nor even really to criticize the neurosciences per se, but rather to insist on their interpretability. Much the same as today, communication metaphors packaged and mobilized scientific knowledge throughout the 19th century society. As Friedrich Kittler, for example, argues in Discourse Networks, media such as the telegraph, typewriter, and telephone affected not only the way people corresponded, but also the way they understood their own bodies. Similarly, Laura Otis's book, Networking, Communications with Bodies and Machines in the 19th Century, sheds light on the conjoined organic and technological worlds in which electronic circuitry furnished a cultural feedback loop, as neurologists and industrialists reinforced the affinity between nerves and wires. While these and other scholars have addressed the metaphorical dimension of the brain sciences, my own work examines the problems broached at the intersection of scientific experimentation and cultural representations. By problem, I mean a question that lends stakes to a debate. At the heart of the brain sciences is the mind-body problem. What is the relationship between mind and matter? Now, the very problem is premised on a dualism between two realms, immaterial and material. Philosophers in the modern era have preoccupied themselves with the task of building metaphysical bridges in an effort to connect the realms that dualism tore asunder. These bridges have taken multiple forms, whether monist, idealist, compatibilist, or materialist, but despite the differences among these various positions, they all hinge on a shared problem that lends them coherence. What I hope to show in my talk this evening is that this problem proved compelling in the 19th century because it was not exclusively philosophical. Rather, dualism took shape within the brain sciences and was sustained in large part by the idea that the brain is hardwired. The proposition is a bit paradoxical, I'll admit, since the conceptual purchase of the hardwiring figure turns on the connection it is meant to forge between the immaterial and the material by installing psychology and physiology within the same circuit. Yet, far from having resolved the relationship between thought and matter by furnishing a new language for a new science, the figure of hardwiring invigorated and even lent renewed urgency to the problem of dualism at the heart of neurology and experimental psychology. So let's jump into the 19th century. That's my period. I'm going to focus on that. Maybe I'll have something to say about the 20th century, but I'm not a 20th century historian. So here we go. Brain research got off the ground when the Viennese physician Franz Gall came to Paris in 1807 to lecture about the new science of craniology. After having drawn the ire of the Catholic Church in his homeland for promoting the materialist belief that the brain is the organ of consciousness, Gall traveled across Europe for a decade, advertising his method of palpating the head's bumps. Once settled in Paris, Gall was joined by his student, Johann Spurzheim, who went on to popularize the term phrenology for the system of organizing the functions of consciousness by means of the observation and comparison of diverse skulls. It was a project that Gall conceived in grade school, where he noticed that the smartest students, those who were able to recite material at length, had bulging ox eyes. The orbital cavity became, for Gall, the region of the skull correlated, or the region of the brain, rather, correlated with language. It was one of 27 distinct locales for mental functions, which he elaborated in his 2-volume, The Anatomy and Physiology of the Nervous System in General, and of the Brain in Particular, with observations upon the possibility of ascertaining the several intellectual and moral dispositions of man and animal by the configuration of their heads, published between 1810 and 1819. Although today rejected as a pseudoscience, and rightfully so, especially in light of its practitioners' claims to order racial types, treat the insane, and train people's moral faculties, craniology nonetheless represented the first systematic approach to cerebral localization. And there's nothing new I'm saying here. Historians of science nearly universally recognize that the origins of the contemporary neurosciences are owed to what we now call phrenology at the beginning of the 19th century. For us, though, it might be easy to take for granted the idea that different regions of the brain govern different mental activities. But in the early 19th century, craniology was groundbreaking for having overthrown the notion of cerebral equipotentiality. Gall's most forceful critic was Marie-Jean-Pierre Fleuron, who claimed that all parts of the cortex are equally responsible for conscious processes. In 1822, the chief scientific institute in France, the Académie Française, commissioned Fleuron to test craniology by ablating sections of animals' brains. He cut the cerebral lobes of birds in particular to find that they no longer perform spontaneous activity. The birds just sat there immobile. Yet they responded with movements when Fleuron stimulated their torsos. He concluded that the cerebral cortex is the site of volition, but that muscular movements, such as walking and flying, issued from the subcortical regions. Against Gall's localization of mental functions, Fleuron claimed that damage to any region of the brain impairs the entirety of the animal's coordination. The claim reflected the widespread belief that the cortex, like the will, is unified. And since the will motivates all specific bodily actions, the brain in which it is housed cannot be divided into distinct regions. Sensation and motion, however, were simple functions of the nerves and muscles. Now, the contrast between Gall and Fleuron throws into relief a deeper transformation in psychology that took place during the early 19th century. By dividing consciousness into 27 functions, Gall and his disciples remained wed to the facultative picture of psychology. Conceived by scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages, faculty psychology partitions consciousness into separate powers: sensation, imagination, and intelligence. And that's what we have floating above this character's spirit here. Avowed faculty psychologists in the 18th century, such as Thomas Reid or Christian von Wolff, added further powers to the mix, such as testimony, sympathy, and intuition. Now, many scholastic thinkers did believe that the faculties bore a relationship to the brain, each of which corresponded to a ventricle through which the animal spirits passed. Although much philosophical ink was spilled in an effort to elucidate, coordinate, and ultimately train the moral use of the faculties, these thinkers agreed that consciousness comprises an ensemble of distinct powers, which, much like entities occupying the material world, have clear boundaries that allow them to be analyzed apart from each other. With the aid of cerebral anatomy, craniologists identified what they thought to be the material locales of faculties in the brain. But they confronted a dilemma. Why stop with the number 27? In Gall's wake, proposals for hyperlocalization of faculties considered upwards of 100 locales. But as observation gave way to experimentation, that is, actively intervening in and altering the physiology of the brain by means of ablation, the facultative picture of consciousness subsided and was replaced by a rival picture that instead structured consciousness around the categories of sensation and motion. Sensory motor psychology emerged out of a basic discovery in physiology: that sensory nerves conducting impulses from the peripheral organs to the brain connect to the spinal cord by the posterior roots, and the motor nerves, conducting impulses outward from the spinal cord, depart from the anterior roots. The functional division of the spinal nerves was the subject of independent studies by Charles Bell in England and the French physician François Magendie, and in turn the subject of an extended imbroglio over who laid claim to the original discovery. Magendie furnished the experimental demonstration for what became known as the Bell-Magendie law. Working with a litter of 6-week-old puppies, Magendie began by cutting the posterior roots of the nerves in their spinal cord in order to desensitize the animal's limbs. Although the puppies did not respond to pressure or even jabs, they did, much to Magendie's surprise, occasionally move their paws unprovoked. Subsequent incisions only to the anterior roots, which were much more difficult to access by a scalpel if you imagine yourself trying to cut up a dog from the back, left sensitivity intact despite their inert limbs. The Bell-Magendie law furnished the analytical tools to decompose mental processes into simpler categories amenable to experimentation on the nervous system. The sensory-motor paradigm of psychology and the project of cerebral localization were the twin pillars of brain research throughout the 19th century. The fundamental insight of craniology, once shed of Gall's fascination with faculty psychology, came to orient the researcher agenda of most neurologists and experimental psychologists. All the way up, in fact, to the 20th century. Here we have Wilder Penfield's representation of the sensory-motor homunculus. Penfield conducted his work in the 1950s by electronically stimulating the somatosensory and motor cortices, which allowed him to identify the particular regions responsible for distinct sensations and motions. Now, the size of the cortex associated with a given body part is proportional to its degree of innervation and not to its physical size. But the development of sensory-motor psychology in the 19th century was not an innocent affair. The division between sensory and motor nerves depended on a problematic division between voluntary and involuntary nervous systems. Sensation and motion were understood to inhere in the latter. Charles Bell noted that the brain is, quote, the mandate of the will to be the moving parts of the body. The muscular contractions necessary to execute motion, however, were thought to depend on the cerebellum and to extend down through the spinal cord. Quote, these experiments have clearly demonstrated, Magendie posited, in man and mammiferous animals, the will more particularly resides in the cerebral hemispheres. The physiological distinction between cerebrum and cerebellum was grounded on a distinction between voluntary and involuntary motion, that is, between coordination and execution, which laid bare a metaphysical dualism at the heart of sensory-motor understandings of the self. When René Descartes formulated dualism back in the 17th century, he posited two distinct realms: an immaterial substance, res cogitans, and a material substance, res extensa. Descartes identified the pineal gland, the sole unitary organ of the brain, as the corporeal connection between those two realms. The difficulty this kind of metaphysical bridge poses, however, is that it falls into the trap of location and regress problems. Since the bridge explains the connection between two entities that are different in kind, it must share in the nature of each. Yet insofar as the bridge is, as it were, between the two, it must inevitably reduce one entity to the other. Hence, Descartes' pineal gland located the mind's relation to the body by treating the mind as a localizable entity that occupies space. Even though philosophers have, for the most part, renounced Descartes' substance dualism, the underlying problem persists in modern ideas of selfhood, according to which the human is riven between the realms of nature and culture, or, as contemporary philosophers oftentimes pose the dualism, between the realm of cause and the realm of norms. Causes regulate the interactions between matter in the natural world, whereas norms regulate the interaction within and between humans in our social world. The division preserves freedom, since we can't localize our freedom, at least Kant believed, in the natural world. But dualism, I am suggesting, is by no means a transhistorical notion. Rather, it circumscribed neurologists' efforts to accommodate the will to the emergent sensory-motor paradigm in psychology. The problem came to the fore with the development of the reflex arc by Marshall Hall between 1832 and 1837. Thinkers had been interested in reflex activity, at least since Descartes represented it as such in his Passions of the Soul. You feel the heat, you immediately reflex back. The reflex governs the excitation and relaxation of involuntary activities, including blinking, sneezing, vomiting, coughing. In his experiments, Hall noticed that by irritating a given part of animals, movement persisted in the absence of motility and sensation, demonstrating that reflex activities does not depend on the cerebral cortex. Hall's account of the reflex arc proved significant because it explained the connection within the central nervous system between excitation and motion in exclusively mechanistic terms. It is a blind operation. But Hall framed the body's automatic activity around a division between two nervous systems: a cerebral nervous system governing volitional relations to the external world, and a spinal system governing material relations. Today, we divide the autonomic nervous system into sympathetic functions responsible for muscular activation and parasympathetic functions responsible for the conservation of bodily resources. But the origins of the reflex principle evince a duality between mind and body, whereby the reflex activity of the nervous system bypasses the brain, operating independent of the will's directives. The reflex governed the central nervous system but extended no higher than the medulla. Sense consciousness, so Hall believed, is perched above the spinal cord. This discovery of a purely physiological form of embodied communication set in motion a dynamic among neurologists and experimental psychologists to extend the application of the reflex arc higher up the spinal column, and thus to bring the laws governing the nervous system into harmony with the laws governing the physical world. The figure of hardwiring lent traction to this very project. The German physiologist Émile Dubois-Reymond conducted experiments on electrical impulses, demonstrating that the outer surface of a muscle or nerve has a positive valence relative to the interior. During stimulation and contraction, however, this relationship oftentimes is reversed. His studies coalesced in what came to be known as Dubois-Reymond's law, that nerves are stimulated only by a change in electric current and not a steady flow of electricity. Dubois-Reymond published his findings in Animal Electricity in 1848. The electromagnetic power of the nervous system was self-sustaining, a principle so evident to the physiologist that he regularly invoked the telegraph to describe the pathways of electrical conduction. In an 1868 lecture, he declared, and I'm quoting, "Just as little as telegraph wires do the nerves betray by any external symptom that any or what news is speeding along them. And, like those wires, in order to be fit for service, they must be entire. But, unlike those wires, they do not, once cut, recover their conducting power when their ends are caused to meet again." So here was a notable limitation to the metaphor. Unlike wires, nerves cannot resume electrical conduction once cut. Dubois-Reymond went on to state that although the telegraph provided a useful analogy, it was not exactly identical to the nervous system. But there was actually a deeper problem. The messages communicated in both telegraphic and nervous wires had to be interpreted by someone outside of the circuit, whether as a telegram or as a sensation. In the 18th century, telegraphy meant any system of signals to transmit intelligence. It was not necessarily based in wires. The first telegraphic systems were chains of observers on hilltops about 6 miles apart with telescopes who would pass messages between each other. In fact, in 1832, a chain was formed between Wall Street and Philadelphia to transmit market prices. Needless to say, these systems were far less useful in foggy northern Europe. But when the United States set about constructing a national telegraph system in 1837, Congress in fact envisioned a visual telegraph before Samuel Morse urged an electric one. As Morse wrote in a letter to his collaborator, F.A. Joe Smith, quote, "It will not be long before the whole surface of this country is channeled for those nerves which are to diffuse, with the speed of thought, a knowledge of all that is occurring throughout the land." No one person invented the telegraph. It was instead developed concurrently among overlapping electromagnetic and even electrochemical models. By the middle of the 19th century, electronic telegraphs connected cities across Europe and America. Here is a telegraphic circuit in its simplest form. A and B represent two stations. The circuit extends from the positive pole of the battery E to the key, K, and the electromagnet, M, then through the line L to the other station with comparable electromagnet, key, and earth, so represented by G. That's where the ground one wires, which is represented by the dotted line extending to the negative pole of the battery. A continuous current will run through the circuit as long as it remains uninterrupted. And the armatures of the electromagnets on either end, that is the M's, will be attracted by the cores. But if the circuit is broken by means of one of the keys, both electromagnets will be demagnetized. Thus, breaking the circuit at either station affects the electromagnets at both, as they are in the same circuit. Now, it was in these terms that physiology and psychology were understood to relay coextensively in a continuous loop, connected, as it were, at both ends. The telegraph proved especially useful for positivist thinkers who saw in the marriage between technology and neurology the key to promoting scientific progress and, more importantly, to dispel its chief rival, the otherworldly residue of an immaterial, and so many believed, immortal soul. Hippolyte Taine was one such thinker who captivated French audiences with his materialist approach to psychology in On Intelligence of 1870. In the book, Taine presented consciousness as a collection of images, reducible to sensations caused by reflex activity. The nervous system, Taine claimed, functions like a central telegraph exchange, which he described as, quote, conductor and multiplier, in which the diverse departments of the gray matter fill in the same functions. In other words, the nervous system does not generate ideas, a notion that Taine took to be the vestige of God's power to create ex nihilo. Rather, the nervous system, like a telegraph, relays sensation and motion throughout the body. Taine mobilized the figure to underwrite his reductionist claim that consciousness can be decomposed into hardwired units. The case for reductionism was buoyed by advancements in cerebral localization, a project that crystallized when Paul Broca located the center of motor speech capacities in 1861. His experimental work analyzed motor aphasia, or what Broca called expressive aphasia. As a medic at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, Broca worked with a certain Mr. Le Borgne, or Tin, as he came to be known, a patient who convulsively repeated the phrase tin, tin, whenever questioned by his clinicians. Despite Tin's inability to express articulate language, Broca noticed that he nonetheless comprehended what was asked of him. Quote, "How many years have you been in the Bicêtre Hospital?" Bergson recounted in his files. Quote, "He opened his hand 4 times and then added 1 finger. That made 21 years, the correct answer." Following Tin's death, Broca examined his post-mortem brain to find a lesion in the inferior frontal gyrus, the region that now bears the name Broca's area. Moreover, Tin was paralyzed on the right side of his body, which led Broca to believe that he would find the lesion in the left hemisphere. His belief relied on and reinforced the idea of left cerebral dominance, which Broca claimed not only to grow faster than the right, but also to be more civilized than the sinister side. And hence we find the literature from this period in pieces like Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which are not simply based on 2 personalities, but the twin hemispheres, with the left being more just than the uncivilized right. Back to Broca, however. The question is, what is it exactly that Broca located in Tin's brain? He claimed that the injured region of that third posterior convolution corresponded to an intellectual center for language. but subsequent investigations into aphasia revealed that Broca only succeeded in locating the center for the motor function of language. In 1874, the German physiologist Karl Wernicke located the sensory complement in the superior temporal gyrus, the region eponymously called Wernicke's area, which governs language comprehension. Wernicke did so by pursuing the same psychopathological method that Broca did. He examined the post-mortem brains of patients with receptive aphasia, that is, patients who were able to speak without any grammatical problem, but unable to convey or understand meaning. Now, it's of course fitting that these dual discoveries identified centers of sensory and motor language capacities, since the twin axes of cerebral localization and sensory motor psychology steered neurology and experimental psychology during the period. But researchers' investments in physiology also generated a metaphysical surplus, since it was left unresolved just how the intellectual dimension of language participated in the circuitry of the nervous system. As Wernicke confirmed in his studies, quote, "Nothing could be worse for the study of aphasia than to consider the intellectual disturbance associated with the disease as an essential part of the disease picture." The etiology of aphasia, it turns out, reinforced a dualism between the conceptual realm of language and its sensory motor component. Now, aphasia preoccupied a large swath of the intellectual landscape in Europe. It actually preoccupied the president of this university back when he was a graduate student as well. But in 1891, a young Sigmund Freud published On Aphasia, in which he argued that the neural mechanism for speech is not located in any particular region of the brain. Instead, he presented the motor function as part of a continuous neural circuit. Disease or injury breaks communication between parts of the circuit, incapacitating the actualization of memories in vocal speech, while leaving the memories themselves intact. And this is the representation of his interlocking circuitry of wires that he conceived as the continuous network for language capacities in the brain. Now, circuitry was a serviceable figure used among both materialists and their critics. Perhaps the most celebrated such critic was Henri Bergson, who attracted droves to his public lectures at the Collège de France before he became the first philosopher to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927. In his 1896 treatise, Matter and Memory, Bergson invoked the figure of circuitry in order to challenge the claims of cerebral localization. Quote, "The brain is no more than a kind of central telephone exchange. Its office is to allow communication or to delay it." The figure supported Bergson's claim that memories are distinctly spiritual and cannot be located in the brain any more than conversations can be said to inhere in telephone wiring. The brain transmits memories, Bergson argued, but it does not produce or even store them. Now, the Telephone Exchange Bureau, the precise metaphor that Bergson used, is a service center where workers at a switchboard connect two or more subscriber lines for calls made between them. The Bureau made it possible for subscribers to call each other without requiring direct lines between their houses. But the actual telephonic technology, as well as the metaphor, remained tethered to the telegraph. In fact, the telephone was first called harmonic telegraphy, according to the 1876 patent held by Alexander Graham Bell. The telephone increased the capacity of a telegraphic circuit by introducing vibratory or undulating current in place of an intermittent or pulsatory current. And as the telephone spread throughout Europe, so too did telephone exchange bureaus. But there was also an additional reason why the telephone offered a readily available figure for neurology. The telephone was introduced to the world at the 1878 Universal Exhibition in Paris, where Elisha Gray, Alexander Graham Bell, and Thomas Edison shared Le Grand Prix for the best invention. But by the 1890s, telephone cables inundated the skylines of most European cities. Wiring was everywhere, in Paris, Berlin, London, and Stockholm, connecting the space between buildings as well as the space between ears. But in the intellectual space of the 19th century, the figure of hard wiring underwrote the claims of materialists and their opponents alike. In Freud's later psychoanalytic work, he conceived of the unconscious as a telephone transmitting and receiving communications. I'm quoting at length, "The analyst must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ toward the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. Just as the receiver converts back into sound waves the electric oscillations in the telephone line, which were set up by sound waves, so the doctor's unconscious is able, from the derivatives of the unconscious which are communicated to him, to reconstruct that unconscious which has determined the patient's free associations." As for Bergson, he likened the brain to a telephone bureau in order to tackle an aporia at the center of motor aphasia research. Clinicians noted that aphasics were unable to recall, were able, in fact, to recall the idea of an object, but were not able to express its motor sign. When presented with a fork, for example, aphasics would typically acknowledge that the object is a fork, moving their head in agreement when asked, "Is that a fork?" But when asked to name the object, or even repeat the word fork, aphasics failed. Here's the question: how could memories endure in the absence of their motor actualization? The French psychologist Théodore de Ribot interpreted these cases to mean that a neural lesion incapacitated the motor mechanism for expressing language. In his 1881 book, The Maladies of Memory, Ribot argued that neurology beheld the promise to also identify what he called the motor residue of memories. Now, the motor residue is the permanent trace left on the brain by associations that build up the organic habits of which the smooth execution of our motor skills rely. Ribot found support for his clinical studies of aphasics whose memory diminished in a linear order. They progressively lose the ability to form words, both spoken and written, beginning with proper names and continuing through common nouns, adjectives, and finally, verbs. The order follows what came to be known as Ribot's law, spreading from the least repeated memory to the most repeated. But Ribot believed that aphasia proceeded not only from the weakest to the strongest, following what he called the path of least resistance, but also that the motor residue of memories were located along the linear circuitry of the nervous system. The direction of language loss followed the same direction as the brain's hard wiring. Now, Bergson invoked the same figure to support the opposite conclusion, that the brain can only actualize but not store memories. While I was working in Bergson's library in Paris, I discovered his personal copy of Ribot's book, The Maladies of Memory. And one of my, I guess, proudest memories in the archives, if I can share it, was to find that Bergson wrote a gigantic B, as if to signify, I think, bien, good, in the margin right next to Ribot's idea, where he expresses this in the following passage: "Amnesia of signs is above all a malady of motor memory. That is what gives it its distinctive character, what makes it present itself under a new aspect." The revelation, at least when Bergson was reading Ribot's book, suggests that it was thanks to Ribot's insight that brain lesions only disturb the motor expression of words and not their signs, that Bergson went on to distinguish two kinds of memory in matter and memory: motor memories that the body carries out, such as speaking, writing, or even walking, and image memories that are distinctly psychological, that appear to us as a flash before the mind, or even as an image in our dreams. Herein lies the central claim of matter and memory, that image memories are not spatial entities, but are instead temporal, and, unlike our motor memories, they cannot be located in the brain. Bergson thereby tackled a dualism internal to 19th century neurology and elevated it to a dualism within memory. Using the language of wiring nearly identical to that of his materialist critics, Bergson claimed, quote, "The truth is that my nervous system, interposed between the objects stimulating my body and those that I can influence, plays the simple role of a conductor that transmits, allocates, or inhibits movement." I'm not going to resolve this debate. I think it's a really interesting one, but that's not my task. As an intellectual historian, I instead see my task as one of explaining the emergence and persistence of problems over time. The figure of hardwiring, I hope to have shown, sustained the brain sciences as much as it ensured that their experimental methods and working concepts were inescapably problematic. Indeed, dualism was not so much a metaphysical impasse imposed on neurology and experimental psychology from without, but rather I'm suggesting the conceptual fulcrum that animated their very development. The place of hardwiring in the brain sciences makes this all the more apparent, since it lays bare a problem hardwired, as it were, into their very history. Indeed, far from having dispensed with the dualism between thought and matter, the hardwired brain rendered that very problem intractable. Thank you.